There is a short list of surnames in Poland that historians have never fully explained. Not because the records are missing, not because the families are obscure, but because when you trace them back, through parish registers, through court documents, through the fragments of centuries, they do not behave the way a Polish surname is supposed to behave. They sit in the wrong place on the map. They carry sounds that do not belong to the Slavic tongue. And for a long time, historians simply filed them under exceptions, footnotes in an otherwise tidy national story. Then genetics entered the conversation, and the footnotes stopped looking like footnotes. This is the story of what happens when a surname, passed unbroken from father to son for hundreds of years, is placed next to a genome. It is a story about Poland, but it is really a story about how fragile the idea of a pure ancestry has always been, and how a name can carry a memory that history itself forgot to write down. For most of modern history, the story of Poland was told as a story of continuity. One people, one language family, rooted in the river valleys of the Vistula and the Oder for over 1,000 years. The Polani, the people of the open fields, emerging in the 9th and 10th centuries, consolidating into a kingdom, absorbing invasions, surviving partitions, and remaining, underneath it all, essentially the same population. Surnames fit neatly into that story. Linguists could point to the suffixes ski, wix, ak, czk, and trace them to occupations, to places, to fathers' names. A tidy, self-contained naming system, evolving from within. It was a reasonable story. It explained most of what genealogists actually found, but not all of it. Buried in old registries, particularly in the eastern and southeastern regions of historic Poland, were surnames that did not fit the pattern. Names with hard consonant clusters that Polish phonology does not naturally produce. Names that appeared suddenly in a single village, with no local root, no occupational meaning, no obvious geography behind them. Oral tradition in some of these families spoke of ancestors who came from the steppe, or came from the east with the horsemen, stories dismissed for generations as embellishment. Something did not fit, even before anyone thought to ask a laboratory. This is where the story could have stayed a curiosity. A handful of odd names in old church books. But population genetics does not treat surnames as trivia. It treats them as data. Every surname passed from father to son travels alongside something else invisible, the Y chromosome, inherited almost unchanged along the same paternal line for dozens of generations. Where a name and a Y chromosome haplogroup move together for centuries, geneticists can cautiously read one against the other. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through mothers, offers a second, independent thread, often a very different one. And autosomal DNA, the mixed inheritance from every ancestor in a family tree, adds a third layer, broader but blurrier, capturing centuries of mixture rather than a single unbroken line. None of these tools rewrite history on their own. Researchers are careful to say that a shared haplogroup does not prove a shared identity, and that surnames can be adopted, changed, or imposed. But when linguistic anomaly, oral memory, and genetic signal begin to point in the same direction, the coincidence becomes difficult to dismiss. That is roughly what happened with this small cluster of Polish names. If stories like this interest you, where a single family record turns into a much larger question about who we actually are, this is a good moment to subscribe, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most family trees admit. The first genetic surprise came from the paternal line. Poland, like most of Central and Eastern Europe, is dominated by a Y chromosome haplogroup known as R1a, and within it, a subclade, R1am458, closely associated with the broader Slavic expansion of the early medieval period. It is, in a sense, the genetic backbone of the region's shared story. Most of the rare surnames under study did carry that expected signature, but not all of them. A minority carried haplogroups virtually absent from the rest of the Polish population, lineages more commonly found today among Turkic-speaking populations of the Pontic steppe and the Volga region, and among communities with historical roots stretching toward the Caucasus and Central Asia. That was not supposed to be there. Not in a family that had lived in the same Polish district since before written records began. The conflict did not resolve quickly. It widened. Because once researchers began separating these anomalous names into groups, they were not looking at one hidden ancestry. They were looking at several, overlapping, distinct, and each pointing toward a different chapter of Polish history that the national narrative had quietly minimized. 3 explanatory threads emerged, and for a long time, none of them could be ruled out in favor of the others. The first, descent from the Lipka Tatars, Muslim Turkic cavalry and their families who settled within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth beginning in the late 14th century, granted land and noble status in exchange for military service. Their surnames, over generations, were partially Polonized, even as some communities preserved elements of language, faith, and lineage well into the modern era. The second, descent from medieval German settlers, drawn eastward during the great colonization movements, the Ostsiedlung of the 12th through 14th centuries, when towns across Silesia, Pomerania, and beyond were founded or repopulate under German law, and German origin names were absorbed, generation by generation, into a Polish-speaking population. The third, more delicate thread, descent from Jewish families who, across centuries of shared life within the Commonwealth, converted, intermarried, or adopted Polish surnames, sometimes by choice, sometimes under later state pressure, leaving genetic signatures that trace, on the maternal or paternal side, toward Ashkenazi founder lineages rather than the region's dominant Slavic ones. 3 very different histories. 3 very different human stories of movement, survival, and adaptation. And in a country whose 20th century was defined by attempts to erase precisely this kind of diversity, through war, through border redrawing, through genocide, the genetic evidence carried a weight that went far beyond curiosity. It is worth pausing here on what these results do not say. They do not say that any surname belongs to one people rather than another. They do not prove a single ancestor, a single migration, or a single dramatic event behind any individual name. Genetic ancestry is layered and probabilistic, and researchers studying these lineages are consistently careful to frame their findings as patterns worth investigating further, not verdicts. What changed the conversation from speculation to serious study was the arrival of larger, better calibrated datasets, broader reference panels covering not just modern Polish populations but neighboring Lithuanian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, German, and Volga region samples, allowing far more precise comparison than earlier, smaller surname studies had allowed. With that expanded comparison, the anomalous lineages stopped looking like noise. They resolved into consistent, geographically coherent signals, each cluster of surnames aligning statistically with a distinct historical population, in a way too structured to be pure coincidence. That was the moment the story stopped being about a handful of odd names and became a study of Poland's actual demographic depth. And then came the twist. Not the Tatar lineages. Not the German ones. Not even the Jewish-associated signatures, striking as they were. The most unexpected finding involved a small number of surnames whose Y chromosome lineages matched none of the above, instead aligning most closely with populations from the far eastern reaches of the historic Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in territories that are today part of Belarus. Populations shaped, in turn, by even older contact with Baltic-speaking tribes who occupied the region long before Slavic-speaking groups arrived. In other words, beneath the Tatar layer, beneath the German layer, beneath the Jewish layer, sat a still older thread, a pre-Slavic Baltic substrate, absorbed so long ago into the region's population that almost nothing in the historical record hints at it. The genome had not simply confirmed a set of known migrations. It had preserved a memory of something that predates them, a meeting between peoples that history itself had stopped recording. The surname did not create that ancestry. It survived it. A name spoken at a baptism 800 years after the last Baltic-speaking ancestor in that line, still faithfully marking a lineage no document remembered. That is the real shape of the discovery here. Not that a handful of Polish families have exotic roots, that framing undersells what the evidence is actually showing. The deeper finding is that a national population, one that spent a century insisting on its own homogeneity as a form of survival, was never a single unbroken line to begin with. It was and is a composite: steppe horsemen, German settlers, Jewish neighbors, and Baltic tribes, folded again and again into a shared linguistic and cultural identity until the folding itself became invisible. This is not a Polish story alone. It is the story of almost every population that has ever called itself a nation. The map we inherit, clean borders, single ethnic labels, tidy naming systems, is a simplification built for administration, not a description of biological reality. Underneath, every pure population researchers have studied closely, the same pattern recurs. Multiple ancestral streams, absorbed unevenly over centuries, leaving traces that only modern genomic tools are sensitive enough to detect. Picture, for a moment, the landscape where this story actually unfolded. Not a laboratory. A wide, flat frontier where the forests of Lithuania give way to open Polish plain. A country of slow rivers, wooden churches, and villages that have occupied the same low hills for 1,000 years. Imagine a Tatar cavalryman granted land along that frontier in the 14th century, marrying into a local family, his descendants speaking Polish within 2 generations, his name softened into something the village could pronounce. Imagine a German craftsman's family, 3 centuries later, indistinguishable from their neighbors by the time of the partitions. Imagine, older still, a Baltic-speaking clan on that same soil centuries before either of them arrived, absorbed so completely into an incoming Slavic-speaking population that only a single genetic thread, carried silently down one paternal line, remains to mark that they were ever there at all. Different centuries. Different origins. The same patch of ground, holding all of it at once. None of this required conquest or catastrophe to happen. It required only what every century of human settlement requires: neighbors, marriages, migrations, and time. If you find this kind of hidden layering as strange and moving as I do, let me know in the comments which population's ancestry you'd want unpacked next. There is no shortage of names still waiting to be explained. What these rare surnames ultimately reveal is not a hidden scandal in the Polish past, nor a challenge to Polish identity in the present. It is something closer to a correction of scale. The old story was not wrong so much as it was too small. A single-threaded narrative applied to a population that had, in fact, always been woven from several. A surname is one of the few things a family can carry, unbroken, across war, border change, and forced migration, when almost everything else has been taken. It is remarkable enough that these names survived at all. It is something else entirely to learn that, folded inside their sound, they were quietly carrying a second inheritance, written not in any archive, but in the long molecule passed from father to son, tracing back to people history had simply stopped mentioning. The map of who belongs where was never as finished as it looked. Every population carries older signals than its own official story allows. Steppe and forest, settler and native, remembered name and forgotten ancestor, folded together until the seams disappear. Genetics does not erase a people's identity by revealing this. It deepens it by showing how much more that identity actually holds. The surname on the page was never the whole story. It was only the visible part of a much older one, still being read, one genome at a time.